Well, good morning, everybody. It's thank you. It's really good to see familiar faces, and it's equally good to see unfamiliar faces. I'm happy about both of those, and I see a lot of both, so that's great. One of the things that I want to mention is that, along with being a member at Breslau, Chris and I have been members of a house church, and we can't agree on this, and this isn't the only thing we can't agree on, but we can't agree on how many years we've been members of a house church. It's either 47, 48, or 49. But I do want to say that in this congregation here, there are 3 people who we have been in house church with for probably 10 years at various points in our life. So that would include Karen Balmer and Bryce, and Glennis Yancey. And so what I wanted to say is that house church has really shaped me a lot. It's shaped the way I think about church in lots of ways and the way I live my life. So if you don't like what I say this morning, take it up with Bryce and Karen or Glennis. So this morning I'm going to be speaking about things that have particular historical resonance for Swiss Mennonites, those ones whose ancestors came to the Waterloo region from Pennsylvania. So now, probably the Russian Mennonites they're probably sitting back and they're thinking, finally those pure Swiss Mennonites are going to have to take some heat. And meanwhile, those of you who are neither Swiss nor Russian Mennonites, those of you who are like normal people, you're probably thinking, oh, here we go again. For people who talk about conflict resolution all the time, there sure is a lot of trouble swirling around in these haunted histories. But actually, what I have to say this morning is for everyone. It's about letting go of prejudices, reconnecting with Jesus' good news, and to steal a line from my friend Bryce, meeting our multi-faith neighbors on a path towards truth and reconciliation. There are 2 really important reasons for Mennonites to work towards truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada. First of all, we have much to learn from our Indigenous neighbors. I have had the privilege of being a Corps helper on 5 water walks, 3 along the Grand River and 2 along the Credit River. My role as a Corps helper is to support walkers in a variety of ways, including route guidance, help at difficult crossings, providing food, water, and sacred fluid, otherwise known as coffee, when needed, as well as encouragement along the journey. And through this work, I have been moved in ways that both affirm and challenge my own faith. At a closing circle recently, I told my water walking partners that water walking with them has helped me to become a better Mennonite. I hope that during our second hour, we can take some time to consider more specifically ways in which we can learn from our Indigenous neighbors. But there's another, perhaps more basic, reason for us to lean into the work of truth and reconciliation. Because it's the right thing to do. That's what I want to talk about now. We are not alone here at Rockway Mennonite Church. I am not alone behind this pulpit. I preached a version of this sermon in April at my church, Breslau Mennonite, and my computer crashed a couple of days before I was supposed to deliver these thoughts. I was distraught. All those words crafted and then gone. Of course, not backed up either. So after the normal panic, my ancestors spoke to me in remembrances. I had an image of my father, Paul, reading theological tomes in the bathtub late on Saturday night and then writing out his sermon at 4 a.m. on Sunday morning. I imagined my grandfather, Simon, mulling over what he would say on Sunday morning at Strasbourg Mennonite Church while working in his field all week and then selling his produce at the Kitchener Market on Saturday. Maybe I thought after this engagement with my ancestors that it's okay not to have everything pinned down by Friday. We are surrounded by ancestors, those ones that we carry in our hearts, our minds, our spirit, and in our DNA. This is one of the indigenous teachings that I am just beginning to absorb through water walking. Our ancestors are here, walking with us. For many of my water walking friends, this presence of ancestors is very palpable, way more palpable than it is for me. And it's felt throughout the day. And at the feast that closes each day, a spirit plate is first prepared and smudged for all our ancestors as a sign of respect and endearment. This year, I asked some of my water walking partners how they deal with ancestors who are less than perfect or even toxic. One friend smiled and said, "That's why we carry our ancestors with us into circles and sweat lodges. They, too, need healing." And I keep hearing from my water walking friends that even with their imperfections, our ancestors surround us, and they want the best for us, and they urge us to live our lives in a good way. This reminds me of the passage we just heard in Hebrews 12. We are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. Now, all of these witnesses who are listed in Hebrews 11 are also imperfect. For example, would you really hold up David with all his kingly abuses of power as a role model for your children? Yet somehow these biblical characters do offer us hints of faith and an ongoing circle of support and encouragement. Today, I want to invite and recognize my Anabaptist ancestors who stand behind me, especially my Pennsylvania Mennonite forebearers who purchased land right here on Block 2 of the Haldeman Tract and made a life in Waterloo County. This would include David Martin and his wife Maria Good, as well as Peter Martin and his partner Anna Zimmerman, all of whom came early in the 19th century. I hold these ancestors with a great deal of love and respect. I can trace a lot of who I am through this lineage. Whatever kindness I show, whatever desire for justice that moves me, whatever faithfulness I have to the call of Jesus, I owe in part to my Anabaptist heritage. I also have some questions for these ancestors, who certainly were not perfect. A lot of these questions are around their relationship with the original inhabitants of this land. I have a little subtitle in here, and I sort of imagining, so you don't read subtitles here, but I'm sort of imagining Carol Ann coming in with just a brief, musical interlude that sort of captures the feeling of where we're going, but I didn't ask her to do that, so. But I could hear her going, da-da-da-da. Okay. There are two significant misconceptions about Mennonite migration to Ontario, which I have heard expressed by people at my church. We stole the land from the original inhabitants. I can see why this statement might be made. Certainly, in its broad outlines, it does characterize how land in Canada has often been transferred from Indigenous to settler hands. But in the case of the early Mennonite settlers, this isn't really correct. Mennonites from Pennsylvania paid for this land in good faith in the way that they had come to understand how land is exchanged and transferred. They did not steal the land. Sometimes people go overboard, however, and they make this claim: we paid for the land twice. This is also incorrect. Original Mennonite settlers purchased land in the southern third of Block 2. And then when they found out that this land continued to have a mortgage on it, because of the Weasley Beasley guy, they returned to Pennsylvania and they convinced other Mennonites to form the German company to buy the northern 2/3 of Block 2 and solve the mortgage problem. It is simply not true, however, that Mennonite investors paid for the land twice. It was different land each time. The contours of the relationship between Mennonite settlers and indigenous people in this region has shifted gradually. We started with early dependence. One of the first settlers, Jacob Bechtel, was guided by an indigenous person to the type of land that he wished to settle on. This place became known as Bechtel Creek, but it was a permanent Mississauga camp where a patch of potatoes was harvested for Jacob and for his group to eat. This relationship soon shifted to a sense of a little bit more reciprocity. For example, the Mississaugas supplied settlers with fish and game, and the Mennonites accepted that Mississaugas would travel through their settlements using the land for communal benefit. Mennonites sometimes welcomed Mississaugas into warm cabins in cold weather. Gradually, the texture of their relationships drifted towards neglect of indigenous neighbors and collusion with forces pushing indigenous people off of the land. An early example of this is the participation of Mennonites in making and selling alcohol to indigenous peoples, and then joining other settlers in demanding the removal of Mississaugas from Berlin because they were reported to be drunk and causing other problems in the community. The way that we have told the story of coming to Waterloo Township shows this shift from mutual support with indigenous neighbors to a more apathetic and even antagonistic relationship. Jana Martin, a local scholar who is working to reframe some of this early Mennonite narrative, analyzes Swiss Mennonite storytelling by examining 3 20th century plays that tell the story of Pennsylvania Mennonites and Amish people coming to this area. So these plays are This Land Is Ours by Yuri Bender, The Trail of the Conestoga by Norma Rudy, and The New Commandment by Barbara Kaufman. And there are at least 3 distinct ways in which this 20th century Anabaptist retelling supports colonial impulses seeking to assimilate or eliminate indigenous people. In these plays, the land is largely depicted as empty wilderness, in need of taming and cultivating to bring out its true value. This view that the land was an uninhabited wilderness became in Canada a legal basis for dispossession of land from longtime inhabitants, while ignoring the reality, the legacy, and the skill of indigenous nations who cared for and lived on the land in effective ways that we're only now coming to understand. Secondly, much emphasis is placed on the incredibly hard work of carving out farms from this wilderness. Somehow this work legitimized occupancy while contrasting favorably with the original inhabitants who are seen as fluid, impermanent, and later on, even lazy. And finally, legitimacy is established by adopting the promised land motif. For Swiss Mennonites, Waterloo Township became the promised land to which God was calling them. Somehow, the current inhabitants of that land did not seem to fit into God's long-range plan. All 3 of these elements can be found in the Trail of the Conestoga. While enduring the dangerous and the wearying journey from Pennsylvania to Ontario, a character in the Trail of the Conestoga reflects, "Well, if it weren't for the dream of the promised land, I would feel like going home myself. We is just like Moses in the wilderness." And another character traveling with Sam compares their 40-day journey to Canada with the Israelites' 40-year journey to the promised land. And this comparison emphasizes the Mennonites' suffering and their faithfulness to God. Another quote reads, "Well, we have to work, cut down trees. Ach my, there is no end But the land is good, and in the years to come, it will be to our children's children a land filled with milk and honey. Someone who shall not be named, not an ancestor, but an ongoing thorn in my side and love of my life. This someone warned me about the danger of putting all of this retrospective understanding onto our ancestors, right? If I can't understand everything that's going on in my world right now, why should we expect these ancestors to have had perfect vision back then? But we can respectfully turn and ask this cloud of ancestral witnesses some questions. Here are the questions I want to ask, not so much to my 19th century ancestors, but to those more recent from the 20th century. Did you know that money used to buy land from the Six Nations throughout the Haldimand Tract was badly misappropriated by government agents and never reached the intended beneficiaries at Six Nations? Did you ever wonder whether our mission to save souls was actually good news for Indigenous people? And what did you know about the Indian Act? We need another da-da-da-da. Did you ever speak out against it? Privilege is a really hard thing to see, especially when we are the privileged ones. Like fish, we don't notice the water. Ignorance can be a form of privilege. I regret that for half of my career as an elementary school teacher, I did not know or pay attention to the reality of Indian residential schools. I could afford to be ignorant because residential schools did not affect me personally. The Indian Act is the primary legislative mechanism that Canada used to assimilate, control, and destroy Indigenous people and their culture. So let's try a what-if exercise to understand more fully some aspects of the Indian Act that may move us beyond our privileged ignorance. What if Mennonites were forced to elect a chief every 2 years and all decisions of the church would be made by this chief and elected council? Other forms of decision-making in the church would not be recognized as legitimate. For example, finding consensus through prayer and discussion, using the lot, asking people to lead in areas of their gifts. What if Mennonite women who married outside the Mennonite circle could no longer be considered Mennonite, and nor could children of such marriages be considered Mennonite? What if Mennonites were relocated from lands that they lived on and farmed for a long time and were forced to live on reserves, which were often inferior lands that other people didn't really want? What if Mennonites were given the legal rights of people and citizens only if they renounced their Mennonite faith? What if lands on Mennonite reserves could be expropriated whenever needed for public projects, and even entire communities could be relocated without consent if they were too close to larger centers of civilization? What if the government replaced traditional Mennonite names with names assigned by the government? What if Mennonites were forbidden to sell any produce from their farms outside of the Mennonite reserves without permission from the government-appointed Mennonite agent? Nor would they be allowed to band together to buy farm equipment without permission. What if it was illegal to sell any form of ammunition to Mennonites? After all, Mennonites proved at Munster that they're really violent revolutionaries. What if Mennonites were not allowed to consume cider behind their barn or go into town and purchase alcohol? What if it became illegal for Mennonites to practice communion, foot washing, or have potlucks? What if Mennonites were not allowed to leave their Mennonite reserves without permission from a government-appointed Mennonite agent? What if Mennonite parents were forced to give up their children and have them sent to faraway government-sponsored residential schools? While at these schools, Mennonite children could not practice their religion or speak non-English languages. Many of these Mennonite children might even be abused or killed and buried in hidden graves. What if Mennonites were not allowed to wear traditional Mennonite garb in public or to sing hymns in public? Ooh, that would be a heavy one. What if Mennonites were not allowed to form any non-religious organizations with possible political interests? Clearly, this would include MCC. What if Mennonites were not allowed to hire or use lawyers? What if Mennonites were not allowed to enter into pool halls? Or perhaps we should also add thrift shops. What if Mennonites were not allowed to vote because they were practicing Mennonites? And what if Mennonites were told, after all of this, to get over it, quit holding on to their precious victimhood? It's all in the past, it's all for the greater good. All of these things grew out of the Indian Act for various periods of time, directed not towards Mennonites, of course, but towards indigenous people. Several of these regulations continue today. Where were Mennonites when these strictures were imposed on indigenous people in our country? As an elementary school teacher, I became well acquainted with the dynamics of bullying. There is the bully, often a troubled person who has been the recipient of bullying somewhere along the line. And then there is the victim, someone who may be perceived as weak, but may also contribute in some ways to the bullying. And finally, there are the bystanders. These are people who see the bullying happen, but do not intervene. They may even benefit in some ways from the abuse. As a teacher, I came to understand that it is the bystanders who have the greatest chance of changing the dynamics of bullying. If bystanders stand up to the bully and name the abuse, there is some hope for change in the community. In many ways, Mennonites have been bystanders in the deliberate, ongoing, and systematic cultural genocide of Indigenous people in Canada. For this reason, I believe that it is crucial for Mennonites and other Canadians to lean into the work of truth and reconciliation in our country, because it is the right thing to do. This is where we can draw support and encouragement from our cloud of witnesses. As Anabaptist Mennonites, we have a long and deep heritage to draw from in this movement towards healing and justice. We can look to those ancestors in our midst who did recognize the injustice that was happening at the time. There were a significant number of Mennonites who pushed the church to do the right thing all through the atrocities of the Indian Act, and there were Mennonite churches who took creative risks to stand alongside Indigenous neighbors. In our work towards truth and reconciliation, we can draw from this ancestry. All through their history, there have been Anabaptist and other Christians who resisted the coercive power of the state and practiced nonviolence, justice, and healing. In our work towards truth and reconciliation, we can draw from this ancestry. And when Jesus read from the scripture at the synagogue in Nazareth, fresh from his temptations in the desert, these words defined his ministry. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. In our work towards truth and reconciliation, we can draw deeply from this living ancestry, the provocative presence of Jesus in our midst, who teaches us what it means to be a true ally. There are many doorways to truth and reconciliation. My heart is full of gratitude for the ways that you here at Rockway are already setting your feet on this path. I loved seeing Thomas on his bike that dark morning near Winterburn when he came to walk with us on the Grand River Water Walk. I did not see much of Thomas later that day, but many of my water walking companions, they commented on his faithfulness, his open-heartedness, his perseverance as a community walker. I loved watching your worship service on September the 28th. Wow, what a circle of faithfulness, beauty, and welcome as you gathered with Kelly and Al to learn about and to resonate with the 7 sacred teachings. I enjoyed speaking with members of Rockway's anti-racism working group and was pleased to hear that a significant number of people at Rockway are involved in a book study around Valley of the Birdtail. I know that truth and reconciliation can be really difficult work. As Clarence Kashiji says, all of us have so much to unlearn. Pathways can be uncertain, confusing, disheartening. Big theological questions can sometimes loom over us. Agreement is not easy. In the face of these difficulties, I have 2 words for you. What if? What if everyone at Rockway continues walking through doorways of truth and reconciliation because it is the right thing to do? What if we deliberately seek out ways to learn from our Indigenous neighbors and to strengthen our own faith? What if we take Jesus' foundational teachings on allyship seriously? What if we grab some sacred fluid after this service and get together and talk more about this stuff in the second hour? What if?